So, welcome everyone. Please excuse these technical issues in this fabulous digital age that we're living in right now. I'm Deborah Lupton from University of New South Wales in Sydney, and I'm delighted to introduce Nick Fox and Peter Hinton, who are doing a sort of dual presentation today around the same kind of topic. And that is over the issue of capitalism, neoliberalism, and the new, with square quotes, feminist materialisms. So Nick will be starting us off first, then Peter. They'll both be speaking for about 25 minutes. The seminar is being recorded, just to let everyone know, and please do enter any questions or comments into the chat, but just be aware that those comments will be recorded and that everyone can see them for privacy issues. So if there's anything you want to say that you don't want everyone to see, then don't say it. And so let's get going with that caution in mind. So Nick, I'm pleased to introduce you. Nick has got two kind of affiliations. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Huddersfield in the UK, and he also has an honorary chair in sociology at the University of Sheffield. So Nick, if you'd like to get going, and I'll just apologise, I'll try and turn on my camera again, but my screen was glitching too, so I didn't want to add pose, but I'll try and turn it on a little bit later. But please do go ahead, Nick, with your presentation. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I'm going to turn my video off just to save bandwidth, so you'll have to look at the static picture of me. I just want to start by, in addition to the usual acknowledgements that's always made about First Nation countries, I want also to acknowledge the more than human ontologies of Indigenous Australians, which predate the so-called new materialist ontologies I'll use for this talk today. So today I'm going to present some work developing a new materialist take on critical political economy. And I'll begin with some definitions and outline the theoretical perspective, and then the toolkit of concepts I'm going to use when I ask the question, what does capitalism actually do? This analysis unpacks capitalism's production and market assemblages, but also reveals non-human affects not acknowledged in Marxist accounts. These latter generate unintended consequences for all the human bodies caught up in capitalist political economy. And from this, I'll draw a fairly momentous conclusion, so I claim, about capitalism and neoliberalization. Could I have the next slide, please, Lise?
So Nick, just to say, you are still breaking up quite a bit. Yes, someone's commented on it. We've done our best over the last 15 minutes to try and sort it out, but not quite sure what else we can do.
Do you want to, would Peta like to do her talk first, and I can see if I can make a different connection and come back to me?
Peter?
I'm fine with that. I'm absolutely fine with that, as long as we don't feel like we've got any sort of problematic connections. Now, I'm not as sophisticated as Nick in the sense that I don't have a set of slides or anything like that. I mainly speak from a particular argument that I've sort of set out and so on, and in many ways it did actually follow on from Nick's discussion about the black hole of capitalism that he brings up in his particular talk. So Nick sort of sets a different scene in terms of a Marxist materialist response to the particular questions that we're both very much interested in, and what puts our papers into discussion with each other. So I mean, it'd be a shame to have to sort of go first in that respect, but also I have no problems with that. I can definitely work through my paper discussion with everybody.
Well, that's great. Thank you,
Yeah.
Peter. I really appreciate you being so agile
Yeah,
and resilient.
you have to be. Anyway,
And pivoting and, all those fabulous metaphors. So I'll just introduce you then. So
Thanks.
Peter Hinton is a scholar and educator who's worked across institutions in Australia, Germany and the Netherlands, and she's currently Senior Research Associate and Lecturer at Western Sydney University and a research consultant on projects related to gender inequality. So yes, please do go ahead, Peter, and apologies to the audience about all this confusion. And I also must have been in the confusion. I did forget to acknowledge country. I'm actually on the country today of the Ngunnawal people. And if anyone would like to also mention what country they're on today, please do so in the chat. Thanks very much, Peter, and go right ahead. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the Darug country, and I am situated here both by virtue of where I am currently living, as well as the work that I do through Western Sydney University, which is very much in Darug country as well. So yeah, acknowledgements for that. I didn't expect to kick off today because in some ways I actually felt like my paper was going to be a continuation of what Nick wanted to talk about. And to be really clear, Nick's the person who has a lot of that sort of experience in a very much Marxist upbringing, you could say, and how a new materialism responds to that per se. So my paper always felt like something that was a continuation of a certain discussion that his was trying to have. But I will just put it into context for myself. I know that the paper title said something about their health and new materialism, but in fact we did revise that. And the paper title for mine is There Is No Outside of Capitalism. And that's the sort of conversation that I want to have that has to do with some sort of dynamic and response to feminist, anti-capitalist conversations that have been very prevalent in recent years. And also how I would like to sort of position that in terms of a new materialist conversation. So that's what the premise and focus of my paper is doing today. I don't have slides, unfortunately, but I will talk through some of the discussion that I've set up for the paper. And I do hope that that's going to be enough for us to be able to have a continuing conversation beyond this particular point, and especially in combination with what Nick's doing for his paper today, because I am aware of obviously he and I collaborate and we're very interested in each other's work in terms of what a new materialism can bring to these certain questions around class and capitalism. And historically, and we did actually do an interesting conversation at Western Sydney University in 2019, February 2019. And we had a very interesting conversation around how class and capitalism are very important points for a new materialist, or what people can currently call a post-structuralist / ongoing post-humanist sort of landscape of theoretical engagement. I would argue very strongly that my movement into new materialism, post-humanism, actually has very strong, sociology of the body and feminist post-structuralist, and beyond that, feminist embodied theories type of trajectory. And I think Nick also, he works within a very much of a question of an embodied environment and so on. We come from different trajectories in the sense that I would say mine is more through that feminist post-structuralist interest, and also through sociology of the body interest. Nick is very much informed by Deleuzean and other, specific trajectories in thinking these particular questions. But I think we both feel that those questions, for both of us, they're very much a combined level of interest. So, my paper, like, as I say, is actually There's No Outside of Capitalism, a new feminist materialist ecologic, is the actual title of that. And I'm just going to work through what I've, my written, and I don't have the slides or anything like that, but I'd like to work through the written discussion that I've, produced for today. So I want to thank everyone for your time today. Also Nick, for his, the work that he's done towards this particular environment. And also that I think that the work that we do bridges an important and I think a presumed gap between how we might talk about capitalism and class and how this resonates through what we'd call a new materialist framework, or what people these days try to sort of shove into that category of what a new materialism, or that level of cultural and social theory and so on, and what it's trying to achieve. Now, I personally have been working in that for a long time, since 2014, in a published sense. But like I just said, it for me travels on from an experience of working inside of questions of feminist questions of sexual difference and post-structuralist feminisms and so on, that has an absolute resonance and reason for what it is that we actually want to ask questions about today. And one of the things that I enjoy about my work particularly is that working in a gender studies / sociology environment is I get to work also with a lot of critical race studies, a lot of queer theory, and so on and so forth. So a certain feminist question is not ignorant of a lot larger intersectional social issues that we need to look at today. But what I want to do with this particular conversation, and making a certain claim about there is no outside of capitalism, obviously that follows from a Derridian theme. There is no outside of the text and so on. It really is actually inspired by certain people in my background who, and including Professor Vicky Kirby from the University of New South Wales, who was my PhD supervisor, that there is a way of trying to argue a certain systemic problematic that is absolutely relevant to today, that we need to try and respond to, and what are the tools that we're able to do to be able to work with that or respond to that. And so that's what really my paper is trying to do today, with relevance to this particular topic area that we're interested in. So Nick and I have had many conversations over the past years that I would say include different perspectives on what new materialist informed understanding of social difference in structural terms involves. Nick does come from more of a Deleuzian background, and that's very much going to be relevant and obvious in his paper, I would say, and without trying to reduce it really in any terms, because I'm absolutely not a Derridian scholar, absolutely am not that, but nevertheless I am somebody who has come through an area of gender studies and queer theory that tries to open up this question of difference and social difference in very meaningful terms that we feel a certain new materialist perspective actually brings light to. So, it was a premise, this type of discussion around class and difference was a premise for the seminar that we delivered at Western Sydney University in 2019. And it continues to be a prominent problematic for how we both, Nick and I both, think about the relevance of certain structural issues, structural inequalities as well, like class, inside of a neo-conceptual space that considers, that sort of structuration in its most contemporary terms. And that's why I think the both of us we draw on a notion of what is a new materialist framework. But at the same time, we're both very much wedded to the theoretical conceptual trajectories and genealogies through which our work has pretty much evolved. So I just want to adjust the title of the talk from the one that was advertised. I do actually work within a health context at the moment on a project through Western Sydney University that connects to the Western Sydney Local Health District with the Western Sydney University Caring at the End of Life team. And it's seeking to understand the needs of culturally and linguistically diverse Aboriginal communities in Western Sydney, in relation to end-of-life experience and end-of-life care. So I have been doing that, and I know that's part of the legacy title of the talk. There is also a huge portfolio of thematic detail that we can draw on that might relate to the new materialist perspectives on policy and practice-based engagement with care and health-related matters. But to shift from what the advertised title to the title of my actual talk today, my contribution is there is no outside of capitalism, is an argument that I think resonates well with also Nick's viewpoint when he gets to that on the black hole of capitalism. And it's problematic, not just a problem, but a problematic, a wicked problem that doesn't necessarily engender answers so much as it opens up questions and an engagement that both our papers are interested to explore. So to really sort of deliver this on a personal note, the impetus for this paper came some years back during my fixed employment with the Gender Studies program at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And what was one of the things that was so curious to me there, these words neoliberalism and capitalism, they were these dirty words thrown about by my colleagues, and really, I mean, really thrown about as the dirty terms of the sort of existing milieu in which we were working. In everyday life situations where neoliberalism was considered a dirty word in terms of what it meant for us, in terms of what it meant for the operational academic space and so on. But, you know, I was constantly asking myself, what's meant by this? I was personally in a situation where neoliberalism could have been a filthy word for everybody. And yet the sort of terms of my own employment were so restricted and so destructive. It was almost like, what is it that we're working inside of a feminist and a gender studies milieu? Why are we throwing these terms around in a way that we're sort of so, it's, you know, this is what we need to be contending with? And on the other hand, my own contract conditions and my work inside of that space were so restricted, so neoliberal, so badly you know, confined. It was just, to be really honest and clear, it was one of the worst working experiences that I've ever had in my life in terms of, you know, that ongoing sort of neoliberal engagement that you have to have inside of a university environment. So I was really challenged by that, and it was one of the impetuses for me to want to be able to open up such an argument as this, like there is no outside of capitalism. What are we actually talking about here, and what are we engaging with? So even in my classrooms, I'm constantly challenged by the need to raise the question and problem of neoliberalism and its effects. But, you know, what are these? How do you actually try to quantify them or even qualify them for yourself? What does it mean to be able to work inside of these systems that are not just local, but they're systemic and global, and they are structural? And it's this effigy of market capitalism that encourages, you know, whatever it is that makes the university system sort of work itself in the way that it does currently. And I've definitely been a part of that system, you know, and worked inside of that system and so on, not just in Australia where it's incredibly prevalent, but also I'm saying in the Netherlands. I've also had some great teaching experience inside of Germany, which hasn't necessarily sort of succumbed to the same level of contract regulation, but it's still been restrictive in its own terms, you know. So it's something that's been very much of interest to me, when we can sort of go, okay, well, what is capitalism? How does it make sense? How does it make sense when you work inside of an environment, a gender studies and sociology learning environment, where people are throwing around these terms as though they're dirty words, as though they don't somehow belong to them, and yet they do in the most structural sense, they absolutely have. So I would also look at, the idea of neoliberalism into the smallest of social encounters. Like, when you sit on the train and you look at that sign in front of you that says, if there's any issue with this particular carriage, you can call this number and so on. And it seems to be this sort of end user focused responsibility type of, I don't know, systematic response to be able to follow up what should be greater structural issues for different organizations, including universities, in a much broader sense. I would even say the same thing when I teach inside classrooms, where the expectation is that you bring your own digital device into the classroom, because that's the way you're going to be able to engage with the activity-based learning inside of that classroom. And yet it already assumes that you have the devices and the Wi-Fi and so on that's going to be able to support that. So that to me is very much a sort of question of an issue of neoliberalism that I think we all face today, and we face it in our learning and teaching environments. How else are students going to be able to do or undertake those learning activities if it's not for a reliance on the sort of expectations that we might have intrinsically, not explicitly, about how it is that they can undertake those activities? So it's these sorts of questions around a neoliberal practice that have informed this particular inquiry of mine. And going back to my experience at Utrecht University, what I found most surprising about this largely feminist and post-colonial response to neoliberal capitalism was the very fact that it totally and utterly informed my working conditions and contract conditions, and in the most immediate sense. So I was working to paid contract conditions that held me to account on the most underpaid level of duties possible. And when I tried to draw a comparison, when I had conversations with colleagues in Australia, they just said to me, there's no way that constitutes a 0.75. I was supervising 7 master's students, as well as teaching 2 undergraduate and master's courses per semester across that. So so you sort of, if you want to draw a comparison, you just can't. But nevertheless, there was this language that was bandied about anti-capitalist, anti-neoliberal sort of requirements that apparently we were all expected to work under. So yeah, I was completely surprised by the difference between my contracted hours of duty and the requirements that of my role. I was told by one colleague that I should never have commenced my position when the working visa adjudications were still underway. I asked her how she might actually honour her own commitments within the teaching program that she'd contractually been obliged to. So it was that sort of, difficulty and differential that was a big impetus for the sorts of questions that I want to talk about today. It was a hard learning and starting point, but the tension with that system of the education that I was involved in, the educating I was involved in, and it had a very vocal antagonism within its ranks. It was definitely a deliberate starting point for me in this conversation. And, it opens up that general question that I have. How do you talk about the problems of a system when you're quite literally ensconced in the belly of the beast? How do you talk to a neoliberal university environment, for example, when you quite literally have to live within the belly of the beast? And that has certainly been my experience of it. So as a background, on a political, and I actually want to put that into dialogue with a certain feminist anti-capitalist mentality that I think's been operating quite productively for a long time. And I want to be able to say, in the way that you can even put this into comparison with an anti-humanist argument, there's no capacity for a continuation of this. What is a feminist anti-capitalism? I don't believe it can actually exist and provide something for itself. So we need a different framework for understanding what it is to work inside the ecologics of these systems that our own experience is actually tied to. And that's really the focus of the talk that I'm giving today. So I'm just going to refer to my paper now. On a political basis, feminism has long been a strong voice in the critique of capitalism. So the very idea of anti-capitalism has been intrinsic to its most recent political manoeuvres. And one example is from the recent LSE hashtag Break the Bias winning essay, The Future of Feminism is Anti-Capitalist by Elias Khoury. And in this argument, Elias Khoury suggests capitalism is, quote, an economic system in which means of production are productively owned, and the decision with respect to production, what, how, and when to produce, are largely determined by the forces of the free market that are largely based on profits. And I think, that's pretty much a very general understanding of how we might understand, the way that capitalism sort of operates. And even if we could try to approach that in terms of the university-based educator and research environment. So the feminist argument put forward in response to this was, quote, feminism advocates for economic freedom, and while money equals power, we cannot guarantee that the goals of feminism will be researched with it alone. Economic empowerment undoubtedly prepares the road to individual liberation, but one needs to understand that capitalism promotes individualism over collective action, end quote. And I feel that is a really important point that's being made there, in the sense that when you come from a feminist or any sort of activist stance, when you come from that position, you're already looking at the difference between what is very much a system that relies on individual response, notion, and capacity, that is not necessarily collective in its own opportunities to be able to support and respond to either choice or opportunity. So the point about...
Peta, sorry, Peta, you've got about 5 minutes to wrap up.
All right, I thought we had 20 minutes.
Well, I think you've been talking for about 20 minutes. That's my estimate. So.
I think actually, okay, no, I've probably been talking for about 10, but yeah. So, okay, so let me jump through what I'm trying to do here then. Okay. So there is an importance in what collective action is trying to do and what a feminist community is trying to put up front. But at the same time, my, many of my experiences working with my students and so on have been in terms of being able to think in terms of their own decision making. That have for them has, in a very neoliberal sense, has coordinated with trying to make, their own sort of individual choice and so on in terms of what matters for their own education. So there is another perspective that comes from a policy making perspective. Harris, Rimmer and Sawyer have a clear answer on where gender equality perspectives inform policy practice current in Australia. And they are both aware of international directives that's in contrast with national initiatives on how gender equality is expected to progress and is instantiated in policy initiatives, especially in relation to women's equality today. But I will, if I've only got this sort of shorter amount of time, I'm going to jump over that. And I'm going to get more to the intervention point that I'd like to talk about, that I would say comes through a new materialist lens. And so where my own intervention on these types of conversations comes in is actually a personal encounter. A partner of mine was stuck in traffic in 2007, strangely, and he texted me going, "I hate this traffic." And I wrote back going, "Oh, you are the traffic." So, how does that sort of work? In your thinking, how does that work? And the other one was again where my PhD supervisor and mentor, Vicky Kirby, at a certain point said to me, "We are capitalism. There's no outside of this particular space. You are actually part of the whatever it is that the mechanism or the system of capitalism is, and that's what you're a part of." And so with this thinking, I think a normalized feminist anti-capitalist argument is problematic. It doesn't work. And because there are a number of theoretical entrepreneurs through a new materialist framework that really throw this open, like I said, in terms of an ecological argument. So Jane Bennett is one of those, and she's been an important voice in the way that she's been able to open a question of what our social, relational, ecologic sort of looks like in a materialist sense, and then to build that into a sort of ethics and politics of relation that's been really relevant to how we can currently understand material and social relations today. So she starts with this interesting discussion in her book, Virate Matter. She's pretty much standing at the edge of I think, a bridge, and she's looking into, this particular wasteland. And she's pretty much saying, the sun lit and it hit on these particular points of what was inside of that assemblage, that mass of what was there inside of that, particular shifting with the water sort of thing inside of the waste pool over a bridge in London. And for her, what she has is an understanding of vibrant matter that pushes a different type of relationality. It's not the humans sitting over the things that are doing whatever is happening inside of that space, sort of thing. One of her biggest and informative points is that she's turning around, she's saying we are all, that's an assemblage that we are all equal participants of. And as a result of that, we no longer have a particular relationship with waste and loss and so on that positions the human over the thingness or over the materiality. It is a part of a certain ecology that we are all a part of. And so that starts to make a very different type of intervention in how you want to think about, we'll call it a post-human ecology, or we'll talk about it in terms of a new materialist ecology, how it is that you want to have a different type of relationship with what we'd even call waste matters, or in another respect, what we might even call failure. In terms of an academic or an other sort of occupational sense, it has a very different relationship with these particular byproducts of what it is that human engagement is, in terms of its environment. And so this becomes intrinsic to a notion of a web of connection that informs our lives. It becomes a different sort of ecological thinking that is possible to the way that we might think about our relations inside of and not outside of or extrinsic to a capitalist system, in that even modes of waste and production and so on, the way that they might interact, the way that they might work, comes through this new feminist materialist way of thinking. So for me, that raises a very intrinsic question. What shape might a feminist politics and ethics take when this type of morphology of capitalism is actually considered, when we don't dispense with and distribute and enclave notions of waste and byproducts and so on of our own engagements, social engagements. But what resources can we say that a new feminist materialism might actually bring, that somebody like Bennett's argument might actually bring, for capturing and reworking the different ethical requirements for attending to these existing regimes that we currently live in, the ones that in a political sense we want to position ourselves against, but in some ways we have to actually acknowledge that we are absolutely intrinsically a part of. So how are we going to have those conversations? And what sort of relationality do we end up trying to produce and contribute by virtue of those sorts of relations? So how are we allowed to think otherwise beyond a stance that might be anti-capitalist when we understand there's no outside of capitalism? Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I really appreciate you stepping in and kind of, going first, because I know you weren't expecting to do that.
No, I was expecting to speak more to Nick's paper, but nevertheless, yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
So you're now sharing Nick's paper. Nick tells me that he has dialed in on his phone and it seems to be working a lot better. So Nick, let's see how you go this time round.
Brilliant.
So,
yes. Okay. Let's go for it. Could you just pop back to the previous slide for a moment? This is just to say that what I'm going to do is to develop some work on a new materialist take on critical political economy. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a toolkit of concepts to ask the question, what does capitalism actually do? And this analysis unpacks capitalism's production and market assemblages, but also reveals non-human affects not acknowledged in Marxist accounts. So if we can now have the next slide, please. So this slide offers my definitions of political economy and critical political economy, which you can read for yourself, and also a note about how neo-Marxist critical political economy considers the social relations of capital as structural. Next slide, please. So to explore capitalism, I'm going to apply a new materialist and more than human ontology. And this approach has four principal features. Firstly, materiality is plural, complex, and emergent rather than stable. Second, matter must be explored relationally, looking at context-specific capacities rather than essential attributes. Third, the new materialisms are post-anthropocentric and post-human, recognizing the agency and liveliness of all matter. And finally, they are monist, rejecting another level of structures or systems. And these four features are going to provide my framework for a new materialist political sociology, as the next slide indicates. Next slide, please. So a new materialist political sociology needs to acknowledge a socio-material world that is emergent and relational rather than static. It needs to extend its focus beyond human social practices to the capacities of all matter to affect. And finally, it will adopt a flat ontology in which power is mediated through the more than human assemblages of everyday interactions and events, rather than social structures or underlying mechanisms. Next slide, please. Well, these rather abstract propositions can be operationalized via four concepts which I've drawn from Gilles Deleuze's Spinozist ethology. First, that affects the capacities of bodies or other matter to affect or be affected. Second, that assemblages are brought into being by these affects between matter. Assemblages are unstable and continually emerging and dissolving. Capacities are what bodies and other matter can do. They establish the opportunities and constraints on action, thoughts, and desires. Finally, micropolitics are the flows of power and resistance within the assemblages that produce everyday life. Within this ontology, we may consider capitalism as a more than human assemblage. And to unpack this assemblage, I'm going to ask the Deleuzean question, what does capitalism do? Next slide, please. Marx supplied part of the answers to this question in volume 1 of Capital. What capitalism does is to transform human labor power, that is capacity to labor, into capital. And this is achieved through two relational transactions. One that produces added value commodities or services, for instance, in a factory or other workplace. And a second one that takes place in a market environment of some sort, where this added value commodity is exchanged for the money or material resources that provides the capitalist with a return, that is surplus value or profit, on her or his investment. Well, the next two slides reassess these two Marxist transactions using the ethological toolkit of concepts I've just outlined. Next slide, please. This slide shows the components of a capitalist production assemblage. This assembles raw materials, workers, and means of production, that is tools, technologies, and so on, within a specific place and time to produce added value outputs, goods or services. The key affect in this assemblage uses workers' labor to increase what a commodity can do, for instance, by transforming iron ore into steel. Next slide, please. This slide shows the main components in the market assemblage. The principal market affect between sellers and buyers in this assemblage ascribes an exchange value and a price to every commodity. This enables commodities to be exchanged for money, providing the capitalist producer with their surplus value and hence capital once again. Next slide, please. However, this materialist analysis also reveals other more than human affects in the capitalism assemblage. These are associated with what in classical economics are called the laws of supply and demand. Next slide, please. This slide shows the way classical economics understands supply and demand. The figure on the right-hand side, which is slightly hidden by our pictures there, I think you can see enough of it, shows the price of commodities plotted against the quantity of those commodities sold. And the laws of supply and demand say that if the supply of a commodity increases and demand stays the same, then the price will go down. If the supply stays the same and demand increases, the price will go up. Over time, supply and demand establish an equilibrium price and quantity of sales. Next slide, please. Within a monist ontology, these so-called laws are now revealed as more than human exchange affects between money, commodities, and consumers. And as Manuel de Landa points out in A New Philosophy of Society, these affects operate, quotes, beyond the intentionality and immediate control of individual human actors. Now you'll recall that the market assemblage comprises not only producers, retailers, and buyers, but also non-human elements, namely commodities and money. So in this market assemblage, there are two further complementary affects, which are listed on this slide. First, the capacity of a commodity A to realize a monetary price of X. And second, the capacity of a sum of money X to acquire commodity A. It is these latter two affects that determine the quantity of a particular commodity sold in a market and at what price. The next slides consider the unintended consequences for producers in a capitalist market of these more than human supply and demand affects. Next slide, please. Number one, uncertainty. These non-human supply and demand affects in the capitalism assemblage create great uncertainty for producers. Prices that their commodities can command in the market will depend upon supply of rival commodities and the amount of money available to purchase them at a given price. And producers are faced with two unattractive options: either to sustain prices and lose market share to competing goods, leading to possible terminal business failure, or alternatively attempt to sustain market share while also sustaining income by lowering prices and increasing production. The latter path, of course, further exacerbates excess demand, but I beg your pardon, exacerbates excess supply, and explains the inherent drive to growth observable in capitalist economies. Next slide, please. Number two, waste, which Peta mentioned briefly. These non-human supply and demand affects and the choices they pose for producers inevitably also generate wastefulness. As producers increase production to sustain market share in the face of oversupply, without increased demand, more and more unsold products will be wasted, along with wasted labor that does not generate surplus value. Alternatively, if producers attempt to sustain their prices and accept loss of market share, this will result in unsold products and may over time lead to business unviability and demise, with further waste of means of production. Next slide, please. Number 3, social inequalities. Non-human supply and demand affects are also responsible for fixing commodity market prices independent of consumers' ability to pay, thus contributing to inequalities between higher and lower paid workers and between high and low wage economies. The uncertainty created by these non-human affects may lead producers to attempt to assure business continuity by reducing production costs by hiring lower cost labor, such as migrants or ethnic minorities, limiting the size and quality of the built environment of their factories or whatever, and minimizing costs of work infrastructure, such as washing facilities and workers' leisure spaces. These all add up to social inequalities, including health inequalities. Next slide, please. This analysis also suggests how capitalism has established itself as the dominant economic model globally. First, the affect by which workers will sell their labor power for a wage ties the worker into dependency, precluding alternative means to subsist, such as self-employment or communal working. Second, a market model is an attractive opportunity for new businesses with novel products. However, once in the market, as has been seen, supply and demand affects proliferate competitor commodities, prices are driven down, and businesses have no alternative but to compete in the market and either lose market share or trim margins. For instance, when IBM developed the personal computer, with no major competitors, it sold 500,000 PCs in the first 18 months, twice its initial expectation. But within 3 years, cheaper competitors flooded the market, undercutting IBM. Its market share fell to 8% within a decade, and it eventually abandoned the PC market altogether. So as more and more workers and enterprises in different sectors are drawn into the capitalism assemblage, next slide please, it has become a black hole which progressively incorporates more and more economic activity into its ambit. Well, in their book Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari argued that capitalism deterritorializes social relations, enabling free citizens to interact with anyone and everyone, independent of the constraints on social relations seen in pre-capitalist economies. This capitalist deterritorialization has been progressively enhanced by centuries of deregulation and liberalization of production and markets in major economies such as the US, Australia, and the EU. Next slide, beg pardon, sorry, not next slide. We now see public services such as health, social care, education, and public transport privatized or marketized, while platforms such as Amazon and eBay open up markets to businesses run from citizens' back bedrooms. Well, before I end, I want to offer some thoughts about what this analysis suggests, partly concerning the nature of the state, but then more generally. Well, this work is currently ongoing, so it's a little bit more schematic. But if I could have the next slide, please, now. Pluralist / Weberian / non-critical / bourgeois political economists have regarded the state as a multi-system administrator of civil society. This liberal democratic state comprises policymakers, in other words, the elected government, policy implementers, that's the public sector, the public service or civil service, quangos and independent agencies, then the judiciary, then the military and the police, then welfare services, and finally central banks. I think you need to click the slide again to get the text to come up on this one, Lisa. There it is. Yeah, sorry, I just noticed that. Well, Marx, Engels, and Lenin considered the capitalist state quite differently as a systematic or structural element that articulated the irreconcilable interests of workers and the owners of capital, with a vital role in sustaining the product of capital accumulation. However, close readings of Marx's text suggest that Marx has a second reading of the state as a parasite serving only its own interests in power and control. And Marx offered various historical examples of such a parasitical state, most notably the state under Louis Napoleon III. Can I have the next slide, please? The more than human monist materialism I've applied in this paper, with its revelation that the affects of capitalism constitute a black hole from which neither workers nor bosses can escape, and with unintended consequences of cutthroat competition, waste, and social inequality, suggests a very different take on how to understand the state in these neoliberal times. The state is not a structural adjunct to the capitalist economy, but a further assemblage of human and non-human materialities, brought into being by a complex of material, political, and economic affects. These latter inevitably interact with the more than human affects of capitalism set out earlier in this paper, because as Peta mentioned earlier, there is no outside to capitalism. There is no separate political realm separate from the economic base. So these state affects include rival political perspectives. Thus, in contemporary liberal democracies, left and right-wing politicians are principally differentiated in terms of the extent to which they promote the capitalist market economy. Centrist and left-wing politicians are cautious about allowing the market free rein and favour a more active civil society state, which they believe can reconcile the interests of worker and capital. Meanwhile, there's a hard core of right-wing libertarian politicians still enthusiastically promoting the market as the most efficient means to deliver every aspect of life. For them, growth and wealth creation outweigh the social and environmental costs of competition, waste, and social inequality. They advocate the neoliberalization of everything, from healthcare and education to space travel and environmental sustainability, and consequently a state shriven of much of its civil society elements. Well, the more than human analysis that I've outlined today suggests that these neoliberal advocates are dangerous and delusional fanatics, carrying us all further into the black hole of capitalism from which none can escape. Next slide, please. So I've argued that a more than human analysis of affects and assemblages not only supplies new insights into capitalism, but also reinvigorates criticality. The forces that drive capitalist production and markets manifest continuously in the more than human assemblages of production and markets, producing, from a human perspective, both intended and unintended consequences. This analysis suggests that neoliberalized capitalism is now running out of control and serves no one's interests, from workers in low-paid and precarious jobs through to shareholders whose investments are always subject to fluctuations. In this analysis, capitalism will not wither or implode, as suggested by Marx and Lenin, but will eventually encompass all human economic activity. And it's only the delusional ideologues of the political right that actually believe this is actually a good model of social and economic organization. And if they have their way, we'll see the prospect of Marx's secondary reading of the state coming about, a parasitical state shorn of all but its coercive features of legitimated violence, presiding over the disastrous black hole of neoliberalized capitalism, with rampant inequalities in both wealth and health, and a descent into irreversible climate change. To avoid this fate and to address the widening inequalities in health generated by neoliberal policies, we urgently need to intervene, not to completely overthrow the assemblages of capitalist production and markets, but to disrupt and roll back the more than human affects in these assemblages, and to dismantle efforts to neoliberalize public sector areas such as health, education, transport, and energy production. Much of this effort will depend upon civil society interventions. So my concluding comments, practically, this means intervening in an otherwise otherwise managing production and market assemblages. And here are a few measures. Firstly, the nationalization, golden share ownership, or government franchises of industries such as energy, public transport, and food processing. Promotion of local authority and third sector supported cooperatives, not-for-profit and social enterprises. Reversing privatization of health and social care and other services that impact health and well-being. Measures to assure food security for all citizens. Licensing of certain products in return for retail price maintenance. That's something which you may recall from long, long ago when pharmacy products actually were retail price maintained, which prevented undue competition. And finally, activism through trade unions and consumer groups, as well as through parliamentary and other democratic forums, to pressure businesses to improve wages and conditions of work. My final slide, please. Thank you very much for listening to me. I very much welcome questions and comments now.
Thank you, Nick. And the sound was great, so all's well that ends well. So who would like to make a comment of either Peter or Nick, or ask a question? I can't see any questions in the chat, but do either ask in the chat if you'd like to, or just ask. Oh, there's a hand up. Ruth. Can't hear you, Ruth.
Hi, Ruth. Can't hear you. Yeah.
I think after all this time we'd work that out. Sorry. Thank you very much for both presentations. I really enjoyed them and feel very powerfully in line with both of the kind of explorations, and Peta, really interesting pushing of feminism to confront being within capitalism. I really like that. I guess to both of you, given your European perspective, how do you, can you see the post-growth movement, for example, as a vehicle for the kinds of directions you suggest at the end of your presentation, Nick, deprivatisation, nationalisation, etc. And I don't know if you're aware that in Victoria, in Australia, the government actually did socialise the power sector, which is a very radical thing to do at this time. So it's possible, clearly. But I just wondered, because the post-growth movement has kind of appeared and shrunk and appeared and shrunk, and I guess a war in Ukraine has really affected the potential for those broader inter-institutional movements. But I'm just curious about the vehicle you can see that will capture those shifts away from the black hole.
May I start first of all? Peter, would you like to go first?
No, I think you're actually better placed to answer to this, Nick. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the no growth approaches are obviously entirely congruent with the kind of analysis and Probably not surprisingly, because I've written recently about green capitalism, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a form of greenwashing, where effectively we're persuaded that if we start to consume more and more and more things which happen to be green, like electric vehicles, that this is going to solve the climate crisis. And it's not, because growth in itself is actually part of the problem. And every time you see a politician say, oh, it's fantastic, we've got growth of 3%, actually that means it's 3% at least harder for us to actually meet the climate targets of zero emissions by 2050. And I think I've tried to point out in today's talk how competition and waste and growth are all things which are actually part of the consequences of these more than human affects. So yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it, but I actually think that there's a wider political agenda here, and really it needs to be an alliance of people on the left, across the left and the centre, to actually prevent what I call the neoliberal ideologues from actually moving us in the opposite direction. And I mean, it's a great concern that seeing the difference between a coalition government in New South Wales and a Labour government in Victoria, you can start to see those differences. And I think it's fantastic that energy has been renationalised, and it's great that public transport is not in private control as it is in the UK. So I think that what we need really is to have a perspective on how the democratic left and the democratic centre can actually start to move forward on a very broad front in terms of initiatives which are not going to try to eradicate capitalism. I mean, we've had 150 years to attempt to eradicate capitalism, and it hasn't worked. Yeah. So what we need to get on with now is a whole range of relevant movements, and actually bringing in the climate change issue into this, I think, can be extremely helpful in actually enhancing this agenda.
Do you want to add anything, Peter?
Yeah, no, I think that Nick has a very sort of applied thinking sort of approach to that particular question. And I can only agree with what he said specifically, but I know that he's talking in terms of a certain political climate that he is mainly engaged with. I would still say it applies to Australia as well. I think that, we need to have, that level of some manner of that engagement happening on that side of the politics of it as well. Yeah, so no, I concur.
So just on that topic, what do you both think of Jim Chalmers, a federal treasurer's essay that he published in the Monthly a week or so ago, in terms of a new version of, I guess, of caring capitalism? I mean, does that strike you as departing in any way from?
I am not even up to scratch with that, and I'm currently, as we're talking, just having a quick look for it. So what did he do? He published it in the Monthly, and what was his particular focus on?
Oh, well, I'm not going to do, it's not my talk today, so I'm not going to do a big
true enough. No, but just
so if you haven't caught up with it, but it just kind of reminded me when Nick was talking of even how Labor politics has kind of become far more right wing. But I mean, Jim Chalmers has actually did recently try to make an intervention. I'm not sure how successful it was. It all seemed a little bit vague and fuzzy to me. Yeah. But it was interesting that he did it was very much about a well-being approach to capitalism.
How we rethink capitalism. I'm just looking at the piece
which does depart very much from our recent recent federal Liberal government's approach, but also some of the previous Labor Party approaches as well. So. But it's still capitalist, of course, but yeah, it does seem to have a bit more of a so-called caring capitalism and welfare capitalism
Compassionate capitalism. Is that how we're sort of going to think about that argument now? Compassionate capitalism, yeah. Yeah, that's quite that's difficult to respond to. Look, I'm really interested in what you've just sort of alerted my attention to, and to be honest, you know, with the way that things go in terms of preparation for things and job applications and so on, I missed that, but I'm very much interested in having a look at what that argument is trying to push forward. I think the idea of a compassionate capitalism, in a certain sense, it works outside of the terms of its own engagement, but at the same time, what we're trying to say, if there is no outside of capitalism, or if there is a black hole of capitalism, then there has to be something operational within the systemic sort of space that we're working with that could be more open to these particular responses. I just want to say,
can I add something? Oh, sorry, Peter, you haven't quite finished.
No, you have. Go for it, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this kind of perspective is helpful, but I think that what we have to do is to be very cautious in a situation where this is, as I commented in the previous response to Ruth, if this is based upon continuing growth, then that's hugely problematic. I think what we have to do is in the context of the Australian economy, actually start to do a major rethink in terms of the shift away from fossil fuels and the shift away from exporting fossil fuels in order to, you know, keep the balance of payments in good order. So compassionate capitalism sounds good, but we have to get the right balance between the compassion and the capitalism, I think, on this. And I think that, you know, this requires thinking through very significantly on the left, and I think it really requires some new alliances to move forward in order to get this right. So it sounds like it's a good thing, but let's be very cautious about it.
Well, at least it's a different thing compared with what we've seen for decades here in Australian politics. So, now James has got a comment. I'm not sure what James's surname is, but he says in the chat, the pricing power has to be based on the synthesis of non-human and intertextual cost/benefit for this new materialism. Otherwise, I think it would be another deterritorialization club there. So I don't know if I think that's more a comment than a question. But I just thought I'd read that out. Just need to see if there's any other comments or hands up. Anyone else with a comment or a question? Oh, one new message. So that says, Brooke Jordan says, thanks for the great presentations. I'm just curious about what you both think when it comes to the specificity or universality of changing the kind of momentum or orientation of capitalism. It's a common claim that the abolition of capitalism requires or is conditioned on global transformation. So what do local changes mean in that context?
That's a great question. That's really great. You know, on a sort of broad scale response to that, I would say there is no abolition of capitalism per se. So how does capitalism become something that is transformative or able to be transformed within and I would say this local political sort of environment? But I say that more from a sort of conceptual, contextual viewpoint. Nick might have something else to add to that particular type of response.
It's certainly the case that one country cannot do this alone, and we've seen the history of socialism has been the history of individual countries attempting to do it off their own bat. So I think that this has to be something which actually cuts across national boundaries, and also within your context of Australia, actually cutting across state boundaries as well. And it's right that it's not about the abolition of capitalism, because I think that what I've tried to show is that in my talk is that there are some affects within the market and production assemblages, which are going to be just the same, regardless of whether it's a socialist or a capitalist, quote, you know, these are both in quote marks, society. And the problem is not with those whatsoever. It's actually with these more than human or non-human supply and demand affects. And it's those which have got to be addressed. So I think that what is needed is that this has to be recognized that this is a global issue, and that it's not simply down to the UK or Australia or any other single country actually going their own particular way. Now, it's in some ways it's good that we've now got some major power blocks in the world, and I mean, China is possibly further on in terms of being a centralized economy, which actually can introduce some of these things. And it might well be that we'll actually see that China is going to go way, way ahead of the US, for example, in terms of its efforts to reduce emissions, because it actually has the capacity to do that. But what we have to do is to recognize that these things have to be done globally. And fortunately, the climate change crisis, in a sense, I say fortunately, actually allows us the medium whereby to actually start to make that global analysis. You can't just do it on one continent or north versus south or south versus north or whatever. However, that doesn't mean that you just give up until everything is sorted out at the international scale, because otherwise nothing's going to happen. And we can see with the series of COP meetings that go on and on and on and on, that although there are lots of, you know, fine words actually being talked about in terms of reducing emissions, then individual countries go back and they get on with selling their fossil fuels to the global south in order to keep their balance of payments and things like that. So it has to be think global, act local, which was a phrase which is from a long time ago in my past, and I think it counts just as much as today, if not more so.
Localism, I think, is the other way that Bray Dotty has referred to it. Yeah. Ruth, you also had a question there in the chat, noting the feminist fourth wave has emerged with individualism as action and appears completely wrapped up in materialism. You know, I think that's a really interesting point to be able to make. It's been one of my frustrations in the sort of feminist spaces that I work and that I've taught and so on, that there is some sort of misinterpretation or overlap of any sense of what's a structural issue being brought down to the sort of personal level and the level of individual choice and so on. And I do see that as a product of a neoliberal feminism that's definitely taken traction. It's had hold for quite some time now. And I've found it really necessary to try to teach against that, to try and sort of open up a dialogue around that particular space. But I think that is what we're seeing. I won't call it fourth wave because I don't want it to be. I literally don't want it to be a fourth wave feminism, if that's actually what it comes down to. But I do appreciate precisely that, that observation that you just made in that, And is intersectionality a framework or a format of identity in that? Not in terms of that, what you would want to, so let's say, you know, by a fourth wave feminism. No, intersectionality is still very much wedded to what it is that we're trying to build with and respond to, even through a new materialist feminism. It's definitely wedded to those questions of difference and diversity, that I don't think that a neoliberal individualist sort of understanding of what a feminist identity necessarily encapsulates. And I'm not the sort of person who would actually push myself against some ways of the feminist thinking and so on, but it does concern me greatly that we have, that particular understanding of what feminism does these days.
Well, I guess I could just plug my recent book that explores this.
Great.
If you'd like to have a look.
Stick it in the chat, that'd be fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could I just add to that on the issue of intersectionality? I think that there's been some very interesting things written by new materialist scholars about intersectionality. And I think the important thing is to recognize that we need to move beyond the concept of a few genders and about a dozen races and about six or seven classes, to actually recognize that there are a million or billion intersections that are going on, and that we need to start thinking about difference rather than about identity. Yeah. And I think the challenge to intersectionality theory is to actually make that move. And if it can do that, then it's hugely important in terms of actually acknowledging all the ways in which inequality is produced in this social world.
Yeah. And this actually relates very closely, Nick, to your idea of, a million tiny intersections or a million tiny social disadvantages and so on, that you've written about, quite specifically.
So I won't dominate anymore, but in my research, I found that a lot of fourth wave identified feminists call themselves intersectional feminists, which I find highly problematic, as you pointed out.
Well, I would actually say that's still more I mean, so my job is not to classify, and I don't do that well, and it's part of the interest and enjoyment of the sort of work, the conceptual work that I do, as well as the sort of applied work that I do inside of a feminist intersectional research basis. But yeah, I would still say that's third wave very much, because I don't even know what fourth wave would. I don't even know what it would correspond to if it weren't a very highly pro-positive identity politics in its own sense. I don't know how that would work. Yeah.
Could I jump on and make a response to Ivan's comment in the chat, please, Deborah?
Yes, do.
Ivan says, if the non-human elements are working outside the logic of human intervention and have destructive affects, how can human reason, with capital H, capital R, by the way, compete with the negativity of non-human assemblages? Well, I think that what I've tried to do is, firstly, there aren't non-human assemblages. Assemblages are more than human. They are assemblages of both human and non-human. And the capitalist assemblage include both of those. And what I suggested in the sorts of interventions that might be possible at the end of my talk is a way that we can actually resist the logic of the non-human supply and demand affects. So within that capitalist assemblage, it is quite feasible to change the micropolitics, to use the Deleuzean terminology. So it's not as if we have to throw up our hands in horror and say, oh no, it's a disaster, it's a black hole. Actually, we can drag ourselves out of that black hole if we just recognize what the problem is. That the problem is not down to human intentionality, the problem is down to something about the way that capitalism is actually working. And that if we can resist the neoliberals who are pushing us further into the black hole, then we can actually edge our way out of it. So it's not as black a hole as the cosmological ones. So
we would hope, Nick, because we are the neoliberals in that sense as well. So there's a difficulty with that. But I also like Jan Bo's question, the question about the contradiction between capital and care, namely the crisis of care. Can it be the internal contradiction that incurs capitalism's implosion? Or what methods would capitalism employ to mitigate and grapple with the crisis? I think that's a really fantastic and very applied question as well, because that comes into our current sort of regimes of healthcare, palliative care, end of life, sort of responsiveness and so on. And Nick and I both work across different systems that could raise that question in really legitimate terms.
Yeah, in both the UK and Australia, then social care has been privatized to an extent, for example, in terms of elder care. And my very, very first trip to Australia back in 1997, where I met Deborah for the first time in person. I don't know if you remember that, Deborah, in an office somewhere in the CBD in Sydney. Then I was over here actually doing research on elder care in Australia. Now, what is absolutely crazy, and I think the COVID pandemic has demonstrated, is that capitalism care did not work well as bedfellows at all. And the privatization of elder care is a very good example of why we must not go down the further route of privatizing or neoliberalizing social care. And we have to extract things like that, which really are not suited to a market, out of the capitalist system. And actually that would be, I think, was one of the things that I said at the end of the talk, is one of the ways that we can actually start to do that. But I think that it's really important that we actually, as swiftly as possible, make sure that there's not a further privatization of those kinds of services or health services. And what's going on with Medicare at the moment in Australia is symptomatic as well of the kinds of issues which have to be addressed very quickly, because they just lead to inequalities. People like me can afford private health insurance, and they can afford to pay without having to draw upon a Medicare if I was an Australian citizen, where many people of course can't, and so they'll stop going to see the doctor.
Yeah, and on the other hand, I've been working on a project that is directly related to how sort of end-of-life care works for people from different backgrounds, diverse backgrounds, and so on, Aboriginal community in Australia. And while on the one hand we've got some sort of centralized system, on the other hand, a level of how we talk about compassionate care or compassionate capitalism in these terms is very much wedded to a dominant white systemic system, Western system, of how that care is actually undertaken. And that's been one of the things that's come through there.
So Laura McLaughlin's got a question as well.
I think it's to Nick, yeah.
To Nick, have you seen it, Nick? She says, "Hi Nick, thanks so much for your talk. Many of the solutions you offered seem to me to be aligned with left-wing and or environmental demands that aren't necessarily influenced by recognition of the importance of affect/non-human actors. I would love to hear your thoughts on possibilities for and challenges of collaboration with people not necessarily thinking in terms of non-human agency/affect."
Yeah, I mean, the analysis that I've given you today is innovative and very challenging, both to the left and to the right, because it does not fit into either classical political economy or Marxist political economy. So, I mean, this paper is currently under review for a major sociological journal. I'm hoping that doing more and more talks like this is a way to actually start to disseminate this very radical insight about the non-human, because Marxist scholars have always focused in on human social practices and have really ignored the non-human. And we cannot afford to do that. Once you actually start to do the kind of analysis that new materialism or post-humans allows, you actually discover all sorts of quite strange things which have been missed previously within social theory. So I think that it's about getting this across to people and actually changing the agenda to say, look, I mean, yesterday I was outside Sydney University, and I was looking at all the posters for the introduction to socialism and the what is capitalism talks that are going on, which is the attempts by the left to recruit people, and I was myself recruited in just that way in my first year of university a very, very long time ago, and I still sustain some of my Marxist credentials, but I think it's now Marxism plus or Marxism minus or something, to actually say that what we have to do is we have to get this message out to the left and to the environmental movement and say that things are not quite the way that you've been taught for the last 150 years.
Well, on that ringing note, I think it's probably a good end to this discussion, because we're only a couple of minutes off 4:30 anyway. So unless you wanted to add anything, Peta, to this final ringing note.
No, I mean, you know, for us,
Call
I
to
mean,
arms.
no, I think for us there's an important sort of intersection in what it is that we're trying to argue, though we come from different sort of an analytical viewpoints and so on. And I think this has been a fantastic conversation and I've really appreciated it. And thank you also for the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. All the really great questions. And thank you, Deborah, for doing such a good job in the chair. And
yeah,
I'm really pleased that I finally managed to get my technology sorted.
Yes, it's great it all worked out. So thanks very much, Peter and Nick, and thanks everyone who attended.
Thank you.
Thanks for all the great discussion and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.
And the rest of your days.